Ever since Resident Evil 1 was remade on the GameCube back in 2002 to massive critical success, fans have been screaming for the same treatment to be given to Resident Evil 2, which Capcom at the time was interested in doing. But Shinji Mikami, the creator and manager of the series, chose instead to focus on the development of RE4, which then led to the project being continually pushed back or ignored for the sake of making newer entries. Even with the director of the original RE2, Hideki Kamiya, pestering producers at Capcom about it for years. After a while, it just seemed like a remake of RE2 wouldn't ever happen. That was until August 12, 2015, when Capcom producer Yoshiaki Hirabayashi came out to let the fans know, "We do it," meaning a remake of Resident Evil 2 had finally been given the green light after multiple attempts to get the okay. And after 3 years of waiting for more news on the project, the first trailer for the game was shown at E3 2018, resulting in an explosion of excitement from longtime fans of the series for the return of Resident Evil 2 and classic survival horror. However, while this excitement was justified, it's worth noting that the Resident Evil series and Capcom itself have both gone through drastic overhauls in the 20 years or so since RE2 and the first remake were developed. Highly regarded developers related to those projects have left to create their own studios. Multiple approaches to the series have been experimented with in order to cater to different audiences, and Chris Redfield has had a couple of facelifts. So it was quite evident that the remake of Resident Evil 2 wasn't going to be the same upscaled recreation of the original that the 02 remake was, considering the current state of the series. Now, with that in mind, it would be easy to compare and contrast the recent RE2 remake with the original release to see how well it stays true to what people loved about the 1998 game, but I feel that would be wallowing in the nostalgia a bit, as fun as that might be. Especially when the game is clearly designed to be a new entry into the series, going by statements from the devs, attempting to take the classic PS1 era and bring it into the new direction Resident Evil has been going recently, taking the framing and atmosphere of a fan favorite and merging it with the gameplay and technological advances of the modern series in order to create something entirely new. So instead, let's look to see how RE2 2019 reflects this ongoing evolution of the Resident Evil series, and what it could possibly mean for its future. This is
Resident Evil 2.
Now to start, the first significant challenge in redesigning a modern Resident Evil 2 is the enemy types, as that is a central point for what makes a Resident Evil game and can dictate how it plays. For years, the Resident Evil series has been experimenting with ways of keeping zombies fresh after the gradual saturation of them in video games and media. In 4, the designers chose to replace them with the Ganados, a smarter, sentient type of enemy that had the lumbering movements of zombies, but better mobility as a way to enclose on the player more effectively, fitting the new action shooter focus of that game, which was then carried over into many of the later RE titles. Resident Evil 7 then went with the Molded as a way to pull back to the slower, oppressive feelings of the older games, using something visually distinct from a classic zombie despite acting in a fairly similar manner, though it got a bit tiring by the end since there was very little diversity to them. But considering Resident Evil 2 2019 was a reimagining of RE2, old school shambling zombies were an absolute must, lest there be riots in the streets. So in order to keep to the atmosphere of the original while still keeping to the modern playstyle, the classic zombies were instead redesigned to bring some new fear into a very understood monster. First, with the amount of damage needed to kill them being largely randomized, as every one of them has an individual amount of health specific to them as a way to keep things surprising. Some take a few shots before going down, some a whole clip. In general though, zombies were made to be significantly stronger than past entries, taking a lot of hits to put down, and unless their head is removed, which itself can take a few since critical headshots have been reduced as well, it can be tough to tell if a zombie is down for good, since they can effectively play dead for long periods of time before rising up again. They might slump down temporarily, only for them to surge back to life upon second inspection when walking past. especially since zombies remain even after you leave the room now that there isn't load screens between, which itself noticeably changes the flow of navigating these maps now that zombies can follow you much further, even being able to break through doors. By strengthening the zombies instead of replacing them or giving them weapons, and adding in a bit of randomization into it, the game keeps to the spirit of the series and original game, but makes everything much more frightening through unpredictability. Now, while there are other enemies throughout the game to mention, like the lickers and zombified doggos, a good majority of the game was built around zombies and how you maneuver around them. Or it would be if it wasn't for everyone's favorite fedora-wearing stalker, Mr. X. Interestingly, Mr. X being able to constantly pursue you through the RPD was something that was supposedly planned for the first RE2, but was limited by hardware limitations, and can only be done after working it out with Jack Baker in RE7, where there were planned appearances that were set to occur, but could also chase you down across the entire map now that it was one seamless level, leading to you desperately hiding and circling around objects in hopes of getting around him. After seeing the fans' reactions to the early sections of RE7, the devs then likely decided to use a similar AI system with RE2 2019, but made a few select tweaks that further added to it. After he's introduced, Mr. X is constantly on the move throughout the RPD, and if he loses track of you visually while in pursuit, will begin to rely on hearing to find you, meaning any noise you or anything else around you makes could bring him closer, which slightly changes the dynamic of how combat acts in this game. Because of their limited movement and your firepower, you typically have the upper hand in a lot of your encounters with zombies, but now they have a big beefy bodyguard that can put you in your place. You could be in the middle of fighting off a group of zombies while trying to get an important item, only to hear Mr. X's lumbering footsteps coming from another direction as he beelines for you, with his 10-step strategy for how he's gonna give it to you. If you're in a desperate situation, he can be forced to take a knee, but anything but your strongest weapon will have little effect, and his break is extremely brief. So it's typically better to save up your ammo and run like hell when he's on the move. Shambling corpses and creepy guys in trench coats does not a great horror game make though. They need the right environment to make it all feel intimidating. Atmosphere has always been an important part of what makes a Resident Evil game and how they feel. And one major way RE2 2019 really amplifies the creeping tense atmosphere is its use of the new RE engine that was first developed for Resident Evil 7 after the devs realized the MT Frameworks engine that had been used for almost a decade couldn't do the visuals they wanted anymore. I mean, MT Frameworks definitely couldn't make a model like this. That isn't to say top-of-the-line visuals are the only thing that makes a decent survival horror game, but the details it can add definitely helps, as this new RE2 is able to create some of the most beautiful and horrifying scenes because of this new engine and its ability to scan in real-world textures, giving everything a sense of disturbing realism. It's that kind of detail added into the environment that creates this looming sense of dread, like claw marks dug into the wall or broken police tape fluttering in the wind. This attention to detail even carries over to the monsters themselves, adding in little animation details to how they move, like Mr. X bending down to get through doorways to establish how massive he is, and zombies flopping over objects as they attempt to grab you. At the risk of sounding like a psycho, the quality of the gore itself is amazing too, as the RE engine's new dismemberment tech adds to how grotesque everything in the game really is. Zombies in Resident Evil 2 are now able to respond more clearly to the hits they take and the damage done to them, as their arms, legs, and parts of their heads can be torn off from gunfire, or melted off if caused by acid rounds, showing off the detailed flesh modeled into them. Realistic textures and zombie torture aside, the eerie atmosphere of the game is also benefited through its use of volumetric lighting. Whether it's the moonlit hallways of the RPD or lights coming through the grating in the underground facility, the game uses an impressive dynamic lighting system as a way to set the mood for the environments. Places like the dark room and main hall have this warmer, comfortable lighting to them as a way to visually establish that they are the safe areas, where the sewers and Nest Laboratory are much darker and force you to rely on your flashlight to navigate through them. Because your primary light source in a lot of these areas is through your flashlight, there's also a level of uncertainty created from the shadows surrounding you and your limited viewpoint, reinforcing this oppressive feeling of isolation where you're surrounded by things attempting to murder you that you might not be able to see. Which is me basically trying to justify how I got spooked by a shadow. Admittedly, this system isn't absolutely perfect though, as the change between rooms with extremely different lighting can be quite noticeable at times. But even that only occurs in a few select areas and can be excused as your character's eyes adjusting to the brightness. Speaking of viewpoint, this also leads us to probably one of the more controversial aspects of RE2 2019, the camera system. As opposed to the fixed cameras of the original RE2 or the first-person POV that was attempted with 7 to lukewarm reception, the developers chose to go with an over-the-shoulder camera perspective from the post-4 games. This viewpoint allowed for the best mix of both control over the player's targeting during combat, keeping the challenge of needing precision aim when fighting zombies, while still having a wider frame of view so as to better avoid enemies coming from behind. By shifting the camera slightly during attacks to something up close and personal, the remake also gets across how desperate the struggle of fighting off these monsters is better than any previous game before, namely when they're able to push you onto the ground as they attempt to devour you. Because the perspective was changed, however, there had to be consideration for how this would affect the design, like the placement of enemies and how scenes had to be reworked, since they were originally designed around a fixed camera that didn't move. So enemies were placed in areas where they might not be seen upon first glance, or would burst through windows once you were already past them, requiring some trepidation as you move around corners and can't quite see everything. While not having the direction of these static cameras, this new viewpoint to RE2 does still allow for some great cinematography and framing by knowing how the player will be approaching everything, such as the first liquor appearances or some decent Umbrella Corporation advertisements. Unfortunately, with that said, RE2 pretty much definitively shows that the fixed camera angles from the classic Resident Evil games are effectively gone for good from the series. And while I'm gonna miss them a bit, I'm also okay with that. The fixed cameras were great during the PS1 era and added some stylish cinematography to the horror tone, but they're a bit dated for this type of game nowadays and would likely end up damaging it as opposed to helping long term for a large majority of modern players due to how it can disrupt the flow of gameplay. Cue fans at my door any minute now for saying such blasphemy. It's not as if the devs didn't try to make it work either, since they've gone on record as having attempted multiple times to recreate the camera system of the original RE2 before scrapping it due to technical issues and the fact they wanted to show the zombies and puzzles in greater detail than a fixed camera perspective would allow. The first-person POV from 7 was also experimented with, but this too didn't quite work with the design that was being aimed for. For what the devs were planning, the over-the-shoulder perspective was what worked best, even if it resulted in some fans immediately assuming it was going to play like Resident Evil 4 because of it. Admittedly, to those fans' credit, in terms of the gameplay, the remake's pacing definitely does have hints of the more action-oriented RE games due to its shift in perspective, though leans much closer to the desperate struggle of the original survival horror games with key changes made to the design. Levels are created to have a narrower, claustrophobic feeling to them, as opposed to the wider, expansive maps of the later titles, so zombies and other monsters have an easier time grouping up on you as a way to keep up the tension. To counteract this, you do have the ability to slowly move while aiming, which was introduced in Mercenaries 3D and RE6 as a way to keep a faster pace to the gameplay. However, your reticle becomes unfocused if you do so you need to remain still to get any type of real accuracy when aiming for vital areas, keeping to the more deliberate feeling of the PS1 Resident Evils. By blending both the old and new playstyles with subtle mechanical changes, the game's able to recreate the need to be steady to aim properly from the original trilogy without feeling like it's handicapping the player by locking them in place. Similar to the action-oriented RE games, you're very much given the means to fight off zombies, but actively push towards avoiding confrontation for the sake of survival through limited ammo and the strength of the enemies.
Jesus, stay back!
Fortunately, items, whether they be knives, ammunition, or herbs, are strategically placed across the game so that you're always prepared for a fight when required, especially if you're in need of a blue herb like we always are. Jokes aside, there is a great balance for where you can find items relative to what you're going to be encountering and the equipment you should have, assuming you're being resourceful. Flash grenades, for example, are introduced shortly before you come across your first licker, since they're the most effective way of dealing with them due to their sensitivity to sound, something established in a note you come across earlier. Another flashbang can then be found immediately after that first encounter in the STARS office next to it, restocking the one you may have used, or lightly hinting to use it on that enemy next time considering its placement. Though even if you don't clue in on that flashbang tip, it may still come up if one's able to pounce on you and you have a flashbang equipped, as you end up stuffing one right into its mouth. A popular returning mechanic from RE1 Remake is one where you can use sub-weapons like knives, grenades, and flashbangs as a defense against enemies grabbing you, giving you an effective means of getting them off. However, these items do now take up a slot in your inventory since they can be used outside of defensive purposes, rather than having their own set place within it. So on top of having to balance healing items, weapons, ammo, and key items in your limited inventory space, you now also have to keep defensive items in mind for when you might get grabbed by something, since it can mean the difference between life or death. But while the game is balanced quite well to consistently keep the player on their toes during their first playthrough, requiring you to strategize the most effective way to move forward, there's also a lot of consideration for how multiple playthroughs could go once you know the layout of everything and how to best handle enemies. The Resident Evil series as a whole has always been known for its replayability. Due to having alternate paths and different ways you can approach going through the complex levels themselves, these games have lots of ways to repeatedly revisit them. And since the games are designed to be challenging, there's also value in going back to perfect your runs. And that is even counting the extra modes and DLC content that the series has been progressively adding into the games. Simply taking a look on YouTube, you can find a plethora of different playthrough types for all the Resident Evil games, like knife-only runs to ones where you go through 5 on professional mode while taking no damage. So for RE2 2019, on top of the 4th and Tofu Survivor modes, where you have to run through the entire RPD and sewers with hard limitations to your inventory, and the new weekly challenge function, the base game itself was designed to have the same level of replayability, if not more so. Much like the classic games, where finding the quickest way through allows for multiple playthroughs, there's noticeable ways to shave time off your runs to get better and better endgame rankings, like taking advantage of knowing lock codes and enemy patterns as a way to speed through sections. Then once you get good enough and learn the flow of the maps, you can start doing completionist playthroughs like no item box or no healing runs, or attempt the built-in hardcore mode, which replaces the autosave function with a limited amount of ink ribbons like in the original trilogy, and makes enemies significantly tougher, requiring you to be much more meticulous about your playstyle than the standard difficulty. It's just unfortunate that, with all this replayability, this version of Resident Evil 2 doesn't seem to include a second scenario to play, and going through as both Leon and Claire is essentially the same experience. Oh, wait. I got an editor's note here saying this is incorrect and there is A and B scenarios? Huh. I don't know how I missed that. Similar to the original Resident Evil 2, there is a second scenario where you play the other character you didn't pick the first time through. And aside from including a couple differences to the story and unlocking the true ending, the second run remixes the actual game quite a bit, at least in regards to the police station where you spend a large majority of the game. Rearranging key items, giving new weapons to use, and even changing the layout by removing the safe room elements of the RPD main hall so that zombies are more frequent there, means your existing knowledge from your first run can actually play against you. Taking away the item box in the main hall alone drastically changes how you approach going through the police station, since Mr. X appears more and more prominently in the second run, along with enemy placement being mixed around to keep things surprising, making re-navigating the RPD a puzzle in itself, having to plan your routes and how you manage your inventory accordingly now that the only item boxes are on opposite ends of the station. Although, while there is some interesting game design changes between the two campaigns, the second scenario of the game unfortunately highlights a major issue with its story structure going back to the classic zapping system of the original RE2. Now, the way Capcom did this game's story isn't necessarily bad, as there are a lot of great moments throughout, using story beats from the first game while remixing it with new ones to keep it fresh. Claire's relationship with Sherry is given a bit more depth, and her dropping down face-off with Birkin in the Nest Laboratory is one of the best moments of the game. Ada and Leon have great chemistry in their scenes together too, with slight revamps to the story, and better fleshes out their sordid cat and mouse relationship that you see come up in later games, namely in their final moments together. Then there's Lieutenant Marvin and some other side characters who get more characterization than their previous appearances. To the point, I felt genuinely conflicted when I returned back to the RPD and had to kill off Marvin now that he'd turned. However, a problem with this story is how the second run's plot affects the first campaign, or more how it doesn't. Going into the B scenario, it's framed as showing what the character you didn't play as was doing while you were going through the first campaign, starting with the scene at the gates outside the RPD after the helicopter crash. And while there are story beats and boss fights unique to each character, there's also some inconsistencies due to the fact that both are using the same exact general framework, which results in the story feeling less fleshed out than it could have been. Both have the same exact boss fights with Birkin, regardless of the fact Annette could only have been involved with it once. Both characters save Ada and Sherry from the same location around the same time frame, doing nearly the same puzzle, and both use the same items to get through the Nest Laboratory, even retrieving these same key tags from the same places. In comparison, the 1998 RE2 had a much better realized two-part story that created one cohesive narrative, where what you did in the A part had a direct influence on the B scenario. It's not as if the series hasn't been able to do this a second time either, as Revelations 2 also included a similar type of segmented story. With how it's done in the 2019 remake though, the story ends up feeling lacking. Rather than having two halves of a story that complete a larger narrative, it feels more like you just went through the same story twice with just a few tweaks here and there, especially with how separate Claire and Leon are from each other throughout the story. If there was just a bit more consideration with how each character section worked in relation to the other, even if it was just keeping in mind how the layouts of the levels changed, it could have went a long way to make this story feel more fleshed out. My gripes aside though, and it may be too soon to say this definitively, but after the first of likely many playthroughs, RE2 2019 has definitely carved out a spot as one of my personal favorites of the series. Simply put, there's just so much to love about this game if you enjoy Resident Evil, and how it shows how far the series has come in the last 20 years. Going from interviews to the amount of little nods littered throughout, you can tell that the developers genuinely love the original Resident Evil 2 and everything about it, but rather than just doing a one-to-one recreation, wanted to bring it into the modern era as a way to push the series forward, going with the course correction they've been doing over the last few years as they try to return it to its pure survival horror roots, while still respecting that some fans enjoy a bit of action with their horror, which is always going to be a major challenge to try to balance between. Now, there may be some that wanted that one-to-one recreation like the remake of the first Resident Evil, and I'm certain there's already mods in the works to appease those fans, but creatively speaking, that would not have been nearly as interesting as what we got, which in turn likely wouldn't have brought as much interest into the game as it did. And more importantly, considering the reception it's received so far, wouldn't have sent as clear a message to Capcom that fans, new and old, want to see Resident Evil returning to its slower, atmospheric tone. Honestly, Resident Evil 2 2019 feels less like a remake and more like a greatest hits of the series, taking everything fans have enjoyed about it and blending it into a single game. And to me personally, this is the best version of the Resident Evil formula we've ever gotten. Here's hoping, whether it's RE3 getting the same treatment, or whatever they supposedly have planned with the new trilogy that started with 7, we see more of this from the series going forward.